Greetings friends, my name is Pavor Shterma and today we'll discuss the top news of the current day, and trust me, there's something new. Joe Biden's administration has allowed to use the American missiles ATACMS on the Russian territory. The change comes largely in response to Russia's deployment of North Korean troops to supplement its forces, a development that has caused alarm in Washington and Kyiv. A US official and a source familiar with the decision said the easing of restrictions on allowing Kyiv to use the Army tactical missile systems, or ATACMS for short, to hit targets inside Russia is a significant reversal in US policy and comes as some 10,000 elite North Korean troops have been sent to Kursk.
According to the laws of armed conflict, Ukraine has the right to strike any militarily significant target, but it must avoid targeting civilians. There are no restrictions on the range of weapons used in international law. By restricting the range of Ukraine's use of US weapons, the United States has unjustifiably imposed unilateral restrictions on Ukraine's self-defense that go beyond any requirement of international law. Kurt Volker, former U.S. Special Envoy for the negotiations with Ukraine, in a comment to Ukrinform, President Joe Biden's administration has allowed Ukraine to use U.S.-made weapons to strike deep into Russia. Two U.S. officials and a source familiar with the decision said on Sunday, in a significant reversal of Washington's policy in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Ukraine plans to conduct its first long-range attacks in the coming days, the sources said, without revealing details due to operational security concerns, from a Reuters publication.
And following long months of diplomacy, we have the decision only now. But better late than never. We believe that hundreds of Ukrainian lives will be saved when the missile troops will launch pure loads of democracy into invaders and their North Korean accomplices of Russians. Especially after a mass combined strike against Ukrainian energy infrastructure where Russians used 120 missiles and tens of strike drones. The Kremlin has already promised to answer in a mirroring action. Interestingly, what they mean by it, striking Ukraine with Korean ballistics, they've already been doing it. So we enter this stage of escalation. What next? We shall see. Russia has launched hundreds of thousands of different missiles and drones against Ukraine during the 2.5 years of full-scale war, but the most painful and non-human remains mass strikes on the energy infrastructure, power plants and dams, which have an intent to make life of people in Ukraine unbearable. Having no electricity and heating in winter, causing mass floods by blowing up dams, and creating artificial disasters to prevent even the effect of normal life. That's the true face of Russian war, and if many people think that there's no war in Kyiv and other major cities, they are wrong. Air defense warriors make sure that people have at least somehow safe life under daily and nightly Russian drone attacks, and now the strikes on the energy infrastructure have resumed, for the third year in a row. And there's no sign of them stopping. However, the Russian propaganda has stated the opposite, of course.
A massive combined attack on all regions of Ukraine. During the night and morning, Russian terrorists used various types of drones, including Shaheds, cruise, ballistic and aerial missiles, Zircon, Iskander, Dagger. In total, about 120 missiles and 90 drones. Our air defense forces destroyed more than 140 air targets, Zelensky stated in the morning of November 17th. During the massive missile attack on Ukraine on November 17th, Russians hit several DTEK thermal power plants. As a result, the energy equipment was severely damaged, representatives of the Ukrainian energy generation company told in their message from the publication of RBC Ukraine.
And here we are suffering from sleepless nights and power outages again. No matter how much Russians are talking about desire for peace, they still bombard Ukraine and don't stop at destruction of everything that stands in their way of dominance. The aftermath of the strikes include Kyiv, a fire on the roof of a 5-story residential building, Rivne region, a blow to the energy infrastructure of the region, electricity and water supply were cut off, Odessa region, energy infrastructure was hit, the city has lost power and water supply, and all electric transport has stopped. Dnipro, high-rise buildings, an educational institution, and a car were damaged. One person has been reported injured. Mykolaiv, a shahed hit a residential building, 2 dead, 6 more people injured. And today in our studio we have Mr. Cormac Smith, former special advisor to the Foreign Minister of Ukraine. Greetings, Mr. Smith.
Hello, Pavlo. It's lovely to join you.
Thank you very much. And today I would like to talk about missile strikes with you, both the horrific missile strike on November 17th and the recurrent strikes today on November 18th, and the allowance of the Biden administration to hit with ATACMS Russian and North Korean troops in the Kursk region. And to start with, let's talk about the allowance to strike enemy targets deep in the territory of Kursk region. We heard that it was a decision from Washington, but what caused it? Because it didn't seem to be going.
Well, look, my view is, and I have been saying this for many, many months, that that Washington would not give long-range permission until after the U.S. election, because I feel there was a fear in the Biden administration that in so doing could possibly harm their chances against the Republicans. Now, that's all history. Donald Trump has won with one of the greatest landslides in American electoral history in recent years, and is now more powerful probably than he has ever been. So my prediction there was correct. And I've got to say two things on that permission. One, I suppose better late than never, but this permission should have been given at least 2 years ago, and these long-range ATACMS should have been provided at least 2 years ago. And if that was done, probably tens of thousands of innocent Ukrainian lives could have been saved. Because all, as you know, Pavlo, all Ukraine has ever wanted to do is to use their long-range Western missiles to strike at military targets from where these murderous rocket attacks are being launched on a daily basis, and you just mentioned some of those, and also elements of Russia's logistics chain behind the front line. The second thing I would say, and I'm still not, maybe you can help me, I'm still not clear on to what extent this permission has been given. They have talked about hitting targets in the Kursk region, but you know, for me, if that permission is not extended to hitting military targets anywhere within range behind Russia's borders, it's simply not enough. Because the main reason for me is to defend Ukraine and Ukrainian civilians and civilian infrastructure and power infrastructure, which Russia is obviously targeting at the moment. So I am very, very clear. This is better late than never. Should have been given probably 2 years ago. But now that it has been given, the handcuffs need to be taken off Ukraine completely, and Ukraine needs to be able to use these weapons to the maximum in the defense of your people.
I believe that we will see the strike targets of American ATACMS missiles soon because, as Reuters publication have mentioned before, Ukraine is already preparing for a strike with ATACMS on the Russian territory. We are also developing our own missiles. As President Zelensky have said in a radio interview, there are 4 types of different missiles that are currently tested to be produced in Ukraine, but it all takes time. Do you see this time for Ukraine right now? Can we still last enough to develop our own weapons to just stop daily glide bomb strikes and ballistic strikes on our territory?
Well, you know, as you know better than I do, Pavlo, it's a very, very difficult time for Ukraine at the moment. It is good news that this long-range permission has finally been given. It's also good news that the Biden administration has committed to giving the final, I think it's $7.1 billion in Ukraine, in military aid to Ukraine before the end of their administration in January. But you know, in fact, I joined Ukrainian television the morning after Biden's victory to discuss its implications for Ukraine. And I said then and I have said a number of times since in other interviews that I actually believe there could be a silver lining for Ukraine in the Biden victory. And that silver lining takes possibly two forms. One, I hope with Donald Trump's threats to pull America out of NATO, that European leaders will finally wake up and realize that Europe needs to stand on its own 2 feet, on our own 2 feet. And, if there's one area and one area only that I find myself in agreement with Donald Trump in recent years, has been his criticism that many European NATO members have not paid their fair share, paying less than the NATO minimum of 2%. Now, we are seeing some very hopeful signs from Emmanuel Macron in France. We know that Poland is now committed to spending nearly 5%. We know that the three small Baltic states are at either 3%, between 3% and 3.5%. And the new NATO members of Finland and Sweden are both approaching 2.5%. Germany under Scholz, somewhat different. We had the very, very cynical and, in my view, completely pointless telephone call between Scholz and Putin on Friday, which obviously President Zelensky came out very diplomatically against and gave his view that it would achieve nothing because, of course, we know that Putin negotiates in bad faith. And when it's in relation to Ukraine, he always breaks his word. So the truth, that not just the truth that Ukraine knows and that the rest of Europe in particular has to finally face up to, is that Vladimir Putin, one, will not stop at Ukraine, and two, will only stop when he is stopped. Vladimir Putin will never, a just peace for Ukraine will never come out of a negotiation with Vladimir Putin.
That is very reasonable. And we have seen the aftermath of the call between Scholz and Putin on November 17th, mass strikes on energy infrastructure, which were followed today by deadly strikes on Sumy and Odessa on the residential areas with ballistics. Is that a kind of sick diplomacy, the evil diplomacy showing that no matter what you do, I will continue to kill?
Well, I think exactly. And we saw Scholz called Putin, was it on Friday? And what have we seen? What response have we seen from the Kremlin to this so-called diplomatic effort? We have seen some of the heaviest drone and missile attacks on Ukrainian cities and Ukrainian civilian targets in particular over the last 2.5, nearly 3 years. And we had Putin's Kremlin spokesman, Peskov, came out only very, very recently and said that they had no interest in a negotiation around freezing the current lines of contact, which, by the way, freezing the current lines of contact for me and for Ukraine should be totally unacceptable. And the question that Western audiences need to ask themselves is this, and it's twofold. It's one, who would be willing to give up 20% of their territory to a genocidal invader simply so they can go on living in democratic peace as is their right? But more importantly, to the same Western viewers and listeners, who would be how many millions of their fellow citizens, be it in Britain, be it in France, be it in Germany or any other country, or the United States indeed, would they be willing to abandon to the daily systematic rape, torture, murder, plunder, and pillage which we know Russian troops are carrying out in the occupied territories of Ukraine, as they did in Bucha and Hostomel at the just before the end of the Battle of Kiev, and as we know, they continue to do across the occupied part of Ukraine. That is the key moral question that people need to ask who tell me, the idiots who tell me that Ukraine are just going to have to accept that they should give up land for peace. One, why should they? But two, if that were to be forced on Ukraine, and I don't think that Ukraine will accept that. I think that Ukraine will fight on and will find a way through. But if that were to happen, it would be a green light, not just for Putin to continue. He would rest and he would come back later for more. But more importantly, this would be a green light for other despots around the world, and in particular, the leaders of what we now know is a solid axis of evil containing Russia, Iran, North Korea, and of course, China.
Well, the situation on the front line is very tense. We have daily assaults by Russians and their daily conquerors of Ukrainian territory, with threats of up to 100 Southern North Korean troops being deployed to fight against Ukraine. We're not talking about some kind of parity on the front line right now. It is the hardest and the most brutal assault in all 10 years of the war right now happening on the front line, compared only to World War II scale.
I think, Pavlo, that what we need to, yes, and I am well aware that this is very, very hard for Ukraine to sustain. And we see that for the first time in a long time, Russia are starting to make advances, albeit those advances are very slow. But again, we need to remember, and more importantly, key Western leaders need to remember that these advances are being made at the most enormous cost to Russia. We have seen for almost a month now that Russian casualties have been varying between 1,500 and up to 2,000 a day. Now, this is not sustainable, and this is one of the reasons that Putin has had to bring in North Korean troops, because he is finding it harder and harder to recruit Russians to do the fighting, regardless of the fact that he has absolutely no compunction with pouring tens of thousands of his own people into a meat grinder and to their death. The truth is, and what we also know, that the Russian economy is not in very good shape. What Western leaders, and the appeal that I would make, is that Russia is probably in a far weaker state than they would like us to realize. And in fighting terms, it is time to put the boot in on Russia. I have been saying this for some time, and that boot, or a large part of that boot, I hope will be the effective use of not just the ATACMS from America, but we are still waiting for word from Keir Starmer in my country and the British government to allow the Ukrainians to use Storm Shadow. Britain, of course, was the very first country to give long-range missiles to Ukraine in the summer of 2023 with Storm Shadow, but with the restriction that they couldn't be used behind Russia's borders. And we also wait for a similar signal from France. Personally, I very much hope that permission will be given, but personally, I hope it is not announced. I hope that the first we all hear that permission has been given by the Brits and the French to use Storm Shadow and Scalp is when the first Russian military and logistics targets are hit by these missiles. Again, that's another criticism that I have of the Biden administration. Why did they have to make an announcement? Why did they have to signpost this to the Russians to give them every chance to move their forces and their collateral back out of range? Again, this is only this is playing against Ukraine's interest and into Russia's interest?
Well, that is very questionable indeed, because maybe this gesture has been more symbolic, and some people say that we have received it 2 or 3 days ago, and it was only announced yesterday publicly. So we can only guess why it was made so public, and be sure that these projectiles will land on Russian airfields and on Russian logistics that will prevent them from committing more crime and genocide in Ukraine. Thank you very much for this insightful interview. Maybe you have some more remarks to make in a final question. I'll be glad to hear them.
Well, no. I mean, I look forward to Ukraine using this long-range permission. I've already said that it is better late than never. I do believe that it can make a significant difference. I think it can put. I have huge faith in Ukraine's military command, and I do think that in the next 2 months they can use this, I hope, to put Ukraine in a much stronger position when Donald Trump does finally come to power. I hope that European leaders keep waking up. I hope very much that the permission, if not already, has been given to use Scalp and Storm Shadow. And my final thoughts really are that Russia is undoubtedly a lot weaker than they wish us to realize. And of course, they still make veiled threats about retaliation. I find it very amusing. I suppose for my last thought, I find it very, very amusing that Russia is so incensed that Ukraine can use British, French, and American missiles to strike at their military targets, while they have been using Iranian drones and missiles for well over a year to strike at Ukrainian civilian targets and murder Ukrainian civilians. Again, we know Russia lies. We know that Russia is not a normal state. They are a mafia state, and as such, effectively do not have the sort of morals that we aspire to in the democratic world. But think about this. This should make people in Europe and our leaders realize finally what they are dealing with in Russia. And in Russia, diplomacy will not get you anywhere. The only way that Russia can be dealt with, and this has been true for as long as I have been alive, is from a position of strength. Vladimir Putin will only stop when he is stopped.
Thank you very much. We all hope for that the war ends with stopping Vladimir Putin and his genocidal war of aggression and pushing them out of our sovereign territory. Thank you very much, Mr. ATACMS. It was a great pleasure to interview you today.
Thank you, Pavlo.
Have a nice evening. Well, that is all for today. Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel to support us. Share this video and have a nice day.